Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. You're joining us for Jackson Spalding's Real Talk webinar, Preparing Your Brand for an Uncertain Election Season. My name is Heather Vaclav Hooper, and I'm a leader on our business development and marketing team. And as a former political news reporter and news anchor, I've been facilitating debates, and so I'll be joining this conversation, which will be a bit more relaxed, with a number of our panelists from Jackson Spalding as well as Public Impact Affairs. As we all know, a presidential election year tends to really heighten political tensions. We know this has especially been true in 2020 with its compounding crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, social injustice, and economic hardships. The level of transparency and accountability expected from the brands, many of you who are joining us today, is made both by consumers and your employees. And when it comes to political issues, all of this has really shifted. So maybe for joining us today, we hope that we will make the attempt to maintain a neutral standpoint and wondering how exactly you might satisfy those needs and interests of the public. Our goal with JS Real Talk, for those of you who are joining us for the first time or you've been to another Real Talk event, is we just want to have frank conversation. We want to be open. And this webinar, instead of being driven by us, is in fact driven by you, all of the questions you've submitted. Our goal is we want to give you really practical takeaways, everyone on this panel here today, so that you can deploy these immediately into your business and work with your teams immediately. We hope to kind of provide a look behind the curtain, so to speak, to help your brand strategize for Election Day and really beyond. So before our panelists introduce ourselves, I do want to say that just in sharing all of our collective perspectives, that we want to be respectful of our clients. So we won't be speaking to specific names, but rather more to industries and situations versus specific client stories. Okay, enough from me. Let's meet this fabulous panel who's joining us today. We've got folks from both Impact Public Affairs and Jackson Spalding. Charles Edwards, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for everybody being here today. My name is Charles Edwards. I've been at Jackson Spalding for about 6 years now, and I focus primarily on our coaching practice, leading our coaching practice, which really looks at media coaching and speaker coaching, getting clients ready for media interviews, speeches, and any sort of public engagement. I'm also a member of the multicultural practice, which really focuses at Jackson Spalding on communicating to audiences of color, both inside a client's business and outside of a client's business. Similar to Heather, before I joined Jackson Spalding, I was a public radio reporter for about 14 years, covering a lot of politics. And so I'm trying to bring that experience along with the client service I provide to the conversation today. And it's just great to be here.
And why don't you go next?
All right. So I've been at Jackson Spalding close to 8 years in a few weeks, actually. I focus on issues management, and I always say that's a nice way to say, bring us in before you have a real crisis. Let's handle it while it's an issue. And I look at a variety of sectors, work with a variety of clients across education, government, economic development, nonprofit, and retail. Before that, we have a lot of ex-news people here, don't we, today? So before that, I was a news producer at CNN. And I even taught middle school in a past life for 10 years. So I always say there's nothing that will surprise me. And I think I can handle anything that comes my way. And in my spare time, I'm an elected official. I sit on the city council for the city of Tucker. It's a newly formed city. We've been at it for about 4 years. So I feel like it's definitely given me some startup experience as well.
Let's pivot to the team over at Impact Public Affairs. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody, and thanks so much to the team at Jackson Spalding for working with us and collaborating with us on this effort. My name is Nick Juliano. I'm a partner at Impact Public Affairs. We're a lobbying firm based here in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior to my time at Impact, I used to run government affairs for Uber for the Southeast US. I started with Uber around the time when we were first having to take out cell phones to elected officials, explain what an app was, and talk about how you could be connected with a stranger on the internet, and followed it through self-driving cars all the way up to everything they're doing now. So it was a fun time. My political background has been very heavy on the Democratic side of the aisle. I was a member of the state committee of the Democratic Party of Georgia. I led one of the larger Democratic PACs in the state. And actually my first paycheck out of college was from the DPG. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today.
And Brad, why don't you round us out?
Hey, I'm Brad Alexander. I'm a partner with Nick at Impact. I'm I work in politics because I have a philosophy degree and no other real useful skills. Probably been at it for 25 years, spent the first half of that in DC as a press secretary, and then as a campaign consultant, and then later with a senior staff job at the Georgia State Capitol, and now specialize in getting government to do stuff or not do stuff for big companies. And my background generally was on the electoral side was electing centrist Republicans. My departure from doing that kind of coincided with the extinction of centrist Republicans, but I can still have a good partisan debate with Nick once in a while, and we'll go at it periodically here.
Well, I think that you all bring a diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and I think we'll really connect with these questions we've received from everyone. So speaking of, as we said, all of these questions are driven by everyone who is watching. So we encourage you to continue to send your questions during the webinar. You can email us right now at the email on your screen, realtalk@jacksonspalding.com. And listen, if we don't answer them today, we've got a lot of material to cover. Someone from Impact Public Affairs or Jackson Spalding will reach out to you with an answer. All right, let's get down to the good stuff. Let's dive in. Anne, I'm going to start off with you. So a question we received is, with the election being about 2 weeks away and more than 27 million ballots that have already been cast, what kind of communication trends are you seeing among companies, and how exactly are they managing ongoing conversations about the election?
So Heather, it's a great question, and we see that it's working with all the ballots that have already been cast. Most organizations are talking about participation over politics. It's really encouraging voting, supporting voters versus who are you going to vote for? And it's brands across all sectors. We're looking at tech, retail, entertainment, banking, and even local mom and pop shops. I saw a story about a taco shop in Iowa that was helping, get the vote out. Go vote, get tacos. And I am going to break your rule, and I'm going to use some names of some organizations, but they aren't our clients. So I'm not sharing secrets there. But really, brands are using what they do best, right? They're staying within their brand identity to encourage voting. They're being extremely authentic. Let's look at voting merchandising as a trend. Levi's, all these great t-shirts, vote, it's all over their social media. They're making masks that talk about voting, and even Naturalizer women's shoes, right? You used to think of those as your grandma's shoes, but they've got this great, cool, hip campaign right now focused at women. It's hashtag Today We Will Vote. They're supporting and empowering women to go vote. They've designed shoes with vote. When you stand together with your feet, it spells vote across the front. They're giving money to nonpartisan, nonprofit, women, encouraging women to run for office. And then there's Modella. I was watching my Georgia Bulldogs lose to Alabama Saturday night and saw this great Modelo commercial. Their whole theme of their commercials are the fighting spirit. It's something that pushes people to do their best. And you've seen someone become a fighter pilot, and they tell the story of the man who immigrated from Guatemala, started as a dishwasher, then he's an executive chef. So they've took that familiar storyline and they've developed a commercial to encourage all of us to garner that fighting spirit, fighting for our communities and a better tomorrow for all, and get to the polls. So I thought it was really nicely done. And then you're going to look at a lot of companies or organizations are using their resources. And when I say that, I'll give you an example. Live Nation. Not a lot of concerts going on right now. So what are they doing? They're turning venues into polling places. They're offering up their own employees to go and be poll workers, and they're talking about that. We even have State Farm Arena here in Atlanta is offered up for early voting, and it's really been successful. And lastly, when you look at some of the people in the food industry, do what you do well, right? So Cava and Zoe's Kitchen, they're offering free food for poll workers. So there's a way to be in that conversation, but it's really participation over politics and being authentic about it by staying true to your brand.
You talk really about participation, almost kind of, the how do we straddle the middle versus going left or right? And in fact, we received a number of questions about really the question of neutrality. Can a brand truly remain neutral and not take sides? And Charles, is that enough to satisfy the needs and the interest of the public?
Thank you, Heather. I think I'm going to piggyback on what Ann said, talking about participation over politics, because let's be honest, every brand in this conversation and any brand listening is too smart to say that they're going to tell their employees to vote for one candidate over another, whether it's a local, state, or federal election. The challenge comes when a brand gets behind an issue that could be seen as partisan or not neutral by some people. The biggest example this year is Black Lives Matter. Late June and late May, I should say, and early June, we saw a lot of companies say the words explicitly, Black Lives Matter, or if they didn't say the words, they said some iteration of it showing support for the equality for African Americans. Now, again, some people may see that as a not neutral issue. And so I think the first thing that you have to do is when you are operationally figuring out, do we want to take a stand as a company? You've got to really say to yourself, okay, what is the stand that we want to take? And how are we going to clearly communicate that stance? And how are we going to define our support for that stance so that others cannot define it for us? So I think that's the first thing that you have to do. The second thing is you have to anticipate that you are taking a stance that some people may or may not agree with. And so already planning out what your reactive communications is going to be when you get questions about that. So to me, that's really what is important. The second thing, because you asked about, this idea that is it going to satisfy the public? I would encourage brands on this call to really think about who they want to satisfy. One of the things that we've been focusing on with clients during COVID and during the racial and social injustice conversation is really about focusing inside out. So the public is an external audience. I'm not downplaying the importance of the public, but there are a lot of situations where we've seen people get really upset about a brand that they actually never supported in the first place. But who does support your brand are your employees, are your regular customers. So you want to work inside out, inside first, prioritize your audiences and say, when we are looking at our internal audiences, we want to assess. And what I mean by assess, it's really going back to the multicultural wheel that we created for folks. Our multicultural practice here at JS created a racial injustice and social inequalities communications resource. And it talks about the importance of acknowledgement, assessment, actively listening, action, and accountability. I want to hone in on the assessment part for just a second. What we mean by assessment is you want to monitor the pulse of your internal stakeholders, regularly asking your employees, what do you think about this? What do you want us to do about this? What is on your mind? So when it comes to satisfying, you really want to satisfy your employees first, prioritize those audiences and figure out what's important to them, because then your actions can be based on that assessment and actively listening to what they answer in terms of those questions.
Charles, I think pivoting from what you're saying, I'm going to go to Nick. We received several, public policy questions. You talk about really perception and how brands are communicating and carrying that out. So Nick, how exactly does public policy impact a brand's business goals, not just their communication, but their business?
Sure. I think it's first very important to differentiate political from public policy and politics from policy and then regulatory in very distinct spaces. If you look at the way that most large and mid-sized companies interact with government right now, it's in regulatory spaces that don't make the headlines, fly below news coverage, and are on issues that, frankly, most Americans either aren't aware of or would be bored to death by, right? These are decisions being made by state lawmakers, by bureaucrats, and by committees that folks don't generally pay attention to. So the way that most companies, when you talk about lobbying and government relations today, you're not talking about outright partisan political conversations, right? It's not like in general, government affairs representatives are running around state capitals or DC, having more explicit political conversations around the issues that Americans think of as hogging the headlines. What I will say is very important in bridging the political and what makes the headlines with the public policy outcomes that are driven is standing as a brand for your policy goals. So to be a little bit more specific, At Uber, we said that we weren't part of the Republican Party, we weren't part of the Democratic Party, we were part of the Urban Mobility Party. And if you shared the vision for urban mobility that Uber has pushed out, that we think is good for drivers, that's good for riders, and that's good for the ecosystem of our communities, then we're a part of your party and we're going to stand with you. And so being issue specific is how you bridge that political conversation and the right-left divide with your actual policy goals. You know, most people don't realize this, but if you, many of the brands that you buy every day, they're in some type of regulated space, right? We're in this COVID environment right now, which means that there's a whole industry for testing and tracking that formerly existed for other diseases that's been updated now to the pandemic. So business and policy are constantly interacting, which is why having a defined, proactive government affairs, public affairs strategy should be critical to any business.
You know, I think, it's interesting when you say not just critical. My hope is everyone who is watching today has that laced into their dynamic. So we're really not going to drill down to that. It's almost, too little too late. But I do think some of the questions specifically were like, well, how do we manage our consumers and our customers and our employees' opinions? We all know that one viral tweet could destroy trust or ruin profits. So Charles and Brad, I'd like you to chime in on this question. How exactly do brands navigate consumer and employee expectations regarding political involvement?
One thing that comes to mind for me, it goes back to that assessment piece on the multicultural wheel. You have to know what your employees and what your customers' expectations are in order to meet them. So if you're not engaging in conversations with your employees about what they expect, then you should really have those conversations on a regular basis to monitor the pulse. And there are questions that you can ask that can really get to the heart of the matter. Now, when it comes to political expectations, I think Ann hit the nail on the head. It is about participation and over politics. So you're seeing a lot of companies with the get out the vote efforts right now. And I think that's absolutely fine. The question is going to come when you have an employee who shows up with, some sort of paraphernalia on their shirt, whether it's a button or something along those lines, and they're showing up to work with that, what's going to happen? I would say that's a situation to where you already need to have your policies clearly communicated about what is and is not acceptable in terms of a uniform, but at the same time, you're telling your employees, go out and vote, do your research and figure out who you want to vote for. But at the same time, you have to you really have to toe that line.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think most of us who've been at this for a while with big business organizations went through the 80s and 90s with this general sense that it was an accepted norm that the company's job was to drive profits for shareholders. And there wasn't much of a public expectation that a company would go take a position on a political issue. That environment, I think, has fundamentally shifted, particularly for consumer-facing brands. And you get into this place where you have to navigate when something is either such a core value of your organization that you want to go out and take a position on it, or B, when there's such a shared social consensus, either among the lane you market to or among society in general, that you feel compelled to go take a position. And increasingly, shareholders, employees, the general public aren't willing to accept general get out the vote, promote voting sorts of activities as sufficient. And I'll give you a couple of examples in Atlanta recently. One of those was the attempts by the General Assembly, whether it was on purpose or a side effect of what they were doing, to negatively impact LGBTQ rights in a significant way in Georgia that would have placed businesses in a posture of proactively discriminating. The other was the passage of the hate crimes bill in the most recent session, where there was a broad consensus that we needed to do something on these issues. And you had major brands putting the brand, the corporate officers, the employees in the forefront of those fights, and really benefiting from that. And there's a risk on the other side of that, which is that you fail to step up when there's a expectation that's really become a norm that you will step up. So there's sort of risk in both directions that you have to think about. The sort of, old conservative position of, hey, we make money, we don't do politics, we hope everyone votes, is in some ways becoming sidelined, and that makes life just much, much more complicated for everyone.
It almost sounds that that's, a bit more passive. And we know that elections can be and are intensely personal. Perhaps I would say this year more than others. So Anne, I'm going to turn these next questions to you. It's kind of a two-part question that we received. So what advice do you have when it comes to how employees should handle customers or clients sharing questions or opinions about politics and social issues? And then the second part, is it ever appropriate for an employee to share his or her political views with a client or a customer at the workplace or even on social media?
So I'll take the first one first.
I'll repeat it if you need me to.
No, you're good. It's hard, right? It's hard when it's not something like Brad talked about. Signing up to support the hate crime bill was not hard. Jackson Spalding did it, and many of our clients did it. And so, that was one that everybody could come together on and agree upon. If you have a customer or a client coming in and talking about other types of political views, maybe about who's running for president, it gets a little bit harder because we all want to care for our customers. We've built relationships with these people. You don't want to alienate anybody, right? You've got a 50-50 chance there. And I think it's even harder when you're in the service industry, retail, banking, even quick service restaurants. We had a time when we were training 16-year-olds at the cash register to answer some, politically charged questions. And so you're interacting with the community a lot. And I think the biggest thing, you're going to hear me say this many times over today, plan ahead. Help your employees craft a response that feels right for them. It feels right for your brand. We've worked with organizations across the sectors to do that. And I call it acknowledge and neutralize, right? And in our media training, we have something called bridging. You get asked a tough question and you bridge to a safe space. So I'm calling this one acknowledge and neutralize. Let's not speculate. You could say to a customer, let's not speculate. Let's talk about why you're here today. Let me help you. Or depending on your sector, you could say, we're watching all state and national elections right now to see how it does affect our industry. And even going a little deeper, it's my job to help you no matter who's elected. Let's talk through your specific concerns. And maybe you're working at a bank. Let's talk through those specific concerns as it relates to. And so I think there are some ways to get around that and to try to remain neutral. And, just think about the conversation some of us are having with family members right now, too. I think the second part of your question was in the workplace. Is it okay to talk politics in the workplace? And I'm going to say no right now. Charles alluded to this earlier and talked about it. Do you have a policy in place for your employees as it relates to political activity? Not just now, but further down the road. Has it been looked at by your legal counsel? Does it cover political attire like Charles talked about? We're seeing even people wearing masks at work. There's slogans and there's language on those. Do you have rules around that type of messaging? And then look at the fact of, have you set a precedent, in these activities beforehand? Starbucks, right? They had the whole, campaign. They supported Pride. They gave out T-shirts and buttons. And then when it came to Black Lives Matter, there was a little bit of a hesitation, and they did get called out on it because they weren't being true to their brand and respecting what they had done before. So review that policy, share it and talk about it. Explain the why behind it to your employees. I think you've got to be out front with it. You want to respect your customers. And we're not just talking employees nowadays too, Heather. CEOs and board members, sometimes they're the ones that can really get us into trouble. So you have to make sure there's alignment, across everybody.
And I think that, go ahead, Anne.
No, you go ahead, hon.
I was just going to say, and I think, we've consulted on things. We have clients on this call, both from Impact Public Affairs, Jackson Spalding, relationships in the business community from really all over the country, coast to coast. So I think it's applicable both in very large companies as well as smaller, or even in the nonprofit space.
Oh yeah, it's across all sectors. And then here's the tricky one, right? We talk about employees posting on their own social channels, right? They're their social channels. They're not your company's social channels that you can control. And so remember, political speech is protected speech. You don't want to have to reprimand an employee and put yourself into a lawsuit. So I think you talk about it ahead of time. You talk about best practices. I've seen a lot more the past few weeks with people putting on their personal social channels, views are my own. They do not represent the company I work for. And so I think people are being very mindful of that. But again, it's being prepared ahead of time, working with your employees and educating them.
I think you talk a little bit about what that risk looks like. And Charles, were you about to jump in? I saw a thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and mentioned Starbucks, and I think it's a great example. And again, we're going to mention some examples during this call. It's not to focus on one company over others. It's to say there are teachable moments that all companies can learn from. So let's be real. When we're talking about 2020, we're talking about directly the impact that we're seeing on Black people, whether it's George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, the list is long. So there's been a lot of focus and attention from employees and from companies about Black people. But let's be clear here. This is why I like the fact that Jackson Spalding calls the practice multicultural. What you say and what you do for one culture, other cultures are watching. And that's why the Starbucks example is an important one, because Starbucks was one of many companies that was very vocal and proud about its support of the African-American community. But when employees wanted to wear Black Lives Matter pins, they said it's not, a part of the uniform. Now, people called them to task for that because they had previously allowed pride pins to be a part of the uniform to celebrate LGBTQIA. And so then they had to reverse because of precedent. And so I think that's an example that the focus right now in 2020 may be on the Black community, maybe on the African-American community, but you have cultures across the map that are looking at how brands are communicating to one particular culture, because come 2021, who knows what the issue is going to be? And they're going to have the expectation, well, if you're doing it for one culture, you should do it for all cultures. And I think companies really need to understand the multicultural aspect of that.
And I think, keeping it on the concept of risk and what people are willing to take to kind of keep us moving. Nick, can you talk to us a little bit about a question that was asked is, why is there this increased willingness for corporations to take risks when it comes to supporting or not supporting causes and pieces of legislation, which really build on a little bit about what Anne and Charles have said?
Yeah, I think that the short answer is that because there is now a public space that is both immediate and immense for direct conversations via social media that just didn't exist in the past, right? It used to be the case that if you had an opinion, you could express that discreetly to friends, and that was that. That was a conversation. Now we have millions of people, hundreds of millions of people having conversations that are on the screens that we stare at all day while we're at work. They're on our watches if we have computerized ones. They fill everything in our lives. And people are able to create mass movements and have large calls for political action that just didn't exist in the past. And this all happens in real time. You can get news a lot faster just by logging into Twitter than you ever could from watching cable news. So as a result of that, and as a result of people having the ability to make themselves heard, there's increased pressure on brands to respond. Now, while I say that this is, a lot of this is the result of the social media age in which we find ourselves, there's two other factors that I think are important. One is that we have gone through cycles of this in American history. I don't think that all of this is entirely new. When the Reverend Martin Luther King was assassinated, it was Coca-Cola that came out and persuaded Ivan Allen that a funeral be safely held for him here in the city of Atlanta. The mayor was very skeptical of it. Coca-Cola put up the money for it. Krispy Kreme put up a bunch of money for it too. People forget this, but the reason why the Krispy Kreme Donuts location in Atlanta, the main one, is where it is because that road, Ponce and North, were the racial dividing lines. And they built that there to be able to serve both communities, and they joined together with Coca-Cola. So we have seen brands move decisively when they have an understanding of where consumers are and where we are as a country, and take those types of risks. I'll also say that combined with the tech opportunities that people have today, people forget that America has not been a truly multiracial, politically integrated society for as long as we have. We're really going back to desegregation, which was not long ago at all. There's plenty of people out there today who lived through that experience. And so having access to the public forum for the debate of civil rights issues is still a relatively, in the history of the country, new feature for many, many people. So brands, to a point that I think Ann made earlier today, and Charles, brands have to understand where their consumers are, where their employees are, and understand how that relates to both their goals and to where we're going as a country. And I'll say that the arc of social issues in American history has been pretty consistently moving in one direction, and I don't expect that to discontinue.
Okay. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. We're about halfway through, and so we're trying to cover as many questions as we can. If we don't cover them, we promise you we will send an email. And so I want to focus, and Brad, I'm going to turn to you to focus on nonprofit leaders. So we received a couple of questions during this conversation and before. One of these questions was saying, I'm a part of a member-based organization where the revenue is member or donor-based. And the challenge is more, how do we be positional, but not political against our organization's values? So their question is, in this season, Brad, what would your advice be in preparing to strengthen a position after the election or even the pandemic? Do you focus on current members, or do you focus on an external messaging mechanism for this time and beyond?
So, I think where you have to start is understanding what your core values are, particularly in the nonprofit space, because what you're really offering to your members is standing for those values. And, at the end of the day, there's a lot of tactical questions around how you do that. But if your North Star is, we exist for this reason, and this is why we exist, and this is what we do, and you don't waver from that, that's why people signed up in the first place. And you can, I think, generally safely assume that they're going to stay signed up. But the thing I would add beneath that is that if you're doing anything that represents a new direction for your organization, people value a chance to weigh in on it. And they value that whether you do what they wanted to or not. And, to Nick's point earlier, we're all culturally trained that we each get to have an individual voice that's massively disproportionate to our actual, real world relevance in a lot of cases. And so you really want to cater to that and give people a shot at saying, hey, here's what we think we might do. Here's some ideas we have. Can we get your feedback? Let's have a conversation about it. People will often be afraid to do that because the idea is, well, we don't want to spin up controversy. But my take is, in almost every case, spinning up the controversy, having it in a contained way, maybe educating people a little bit on the pros and cons on either side of it is smart. And I'll give you a concrete example of that any of us who have been involved in a nonprofit that has an athletic program that plays the national anthem have dealt with, which is when some players want to clap, some want to kneel, some want to walk off the field, parents and fans and everybody else has an opinion. The absolute worst thing you can do is have a new policy fall out of the sky one day about, how you're going to deal with this, because you've alienated most likely the majority of your stakeholders. But if you run some sort of a process of a couple of weeks to go, hey, this is a controversial issue. We know it's all controversial. We have parents, students, players, investors on all sides of it. Here are some options. What do you think? Then people understand that you don't have a good choice, right? You've got, in essence, a bunch of bad choices, and you're going to have to go make one, and they'll cut you some more slack if your choice doesn't happen to be their choice.
And speaking of go ahead, Charles.
I was just going to say, and with that, there's the expectation that you're not going to make everybody happy, but at least you came together as a group and made a sound decision that you can stand by, and you got input from all of your important stakeholders. I think to set expectations, the goal is not to make everybody happy, because nobody's ever able to do that. But if you're able to communicate that we've talked about this, we've deliberated, and we came up with an idea and a way forward that we can all get behind and agree upon, then at least you've satisfied your most important audience. And again, going back to that weighing who's more important, the public or your employees, that kind of thing, you've given your employees, to Brad's point, an opportunity to buy in, and that's most important.
Well, and I'll say, a follow-up question to this. It was kind of like a 3 or 4 part question from 2 or 3 different people. You're saying, more to the larger group. Well, let's talk about, Brad, you brought up, nonprofits. If you've ever played a role in us, I think everyone here has been engaged with a nonprofit in some way or shape or form. What happens when major donors allude to waning their support if that organization doesn't align with their political leanings? What do you do then?
I mean, look, at that point, you've got a hard choice to make. And part of that, again, it's not what happens in that moment. It's how have you treated that donor for the past 10 years? And do they think they're purchasing shares that they get to vote in your organization, or that they're investing in a mission and get to have an opinion, but they don't get to control things? And, I think the key there is you just have to make it clear what's the expectation in return for a donation. Is it a voice in governance? Is it a name on a building? Is it passive investment in a cause? But you know that you will find yourself in that circumstance, because we're all completely, at this point, apparently incapable of separating our political identities from the rest of our lives. We've got a whole set of behaviors that goes along with how we identify from a partisan standpoint. It's the, do I shop at Whole Foods or Walmart kind of question. And so you almost, as an organization, whether you intend to or not, you're going to take political positions on things all the time. You're going to decide that for employee safety, you don't want firearms in your facilities, and you're going to put up a sign and you're going to take a political position, or you're going to require a face mask, or you're going to say, we promote recycling. I mean, you can't do anything in America now without it being political. So the trick is to think ahead to that and plan for it, know it's going to happen. Talk to Ann, figure out what the contingency plan is when it blows up, because it will. But also just have a set of core values around what does it mean to be an employee, and where's the lines between free expression and damaging a brand, and what does it mean to be a nonprofit board member, and how do I make good governance decisions without trying to turn an organization into my personal weaponized political platform. And if you wait to navigate it at the moment where it happens, you've already lost round 1 of the battle. Somebody punched you in the face and you're having trouble standing and trying to figure out what to do.
Well, and I think it kind of goes back to what Ann was saying too, in terms of preparation and planning. I do want to touch on another question. I'm going to turn this back over to Charles. Charles, I know you're a part of the Jackson Spalding diversity and inclusion team internally, but then also work on multicultural communications. What happens if a brand gets called out for not reflecting the diversity of their community? I know you touched a little bit about this with Starbucks, but maybe just build real quickly on that.
Yeah, there's 2 examples here. So Starbucks was called out because they did not initially allow their employees to wear Black Lives Matter pins. Keep in mind, Starbucks made significant communications that they put out about supporting Black Lives Matter, and have put a lot of money behind their efforts to support Black Lives Matter. Yet and still, the issue with the pins got a lot of attention, and people looked at that as, well, clearly they must not support Black Lives Matter if they don't let their employees wear pins. That's not the case, but again, it's about what we focus on and what the headlines are. So think about your policies far in advance of implementation and far in advance of the scenario actually becoming real. So that's one example. Another recent example that we've seen in a different industry is with Wells Fargo. So there was an internal meeting that Wells Fargo's CEO had with employees, and I'm quoting from Reuters. I'm looking at the Reuters article here. In the meeting, he reiterated that the bank had trouble reaching diversity goals because there were not enough qualified minority candidates. So as soon as he said that, employees who were on that call got mad, spoke anonymously to Reuters, and the story came out. There was huge backlash from that, to where Wells Fargo's CEO came out and apologized. After that, though, you had some top 7 high-ranking Black women leave Wells Fargo saying we need to do more. So sometimes that fallout really happens. Here's the big point that I'm trying to make. Think ahead before, to Ann's point, plan ahead. Plan ahead before the situation presents itself and say, what are the various real likely scenarios that can happen? Think about how you need to acknowledge those scenarios. You need to assess internally where you are, actively listen to your employees, act on what you hear, and then be accountable to the decisions that you make. You've got to see these things coming far in advance, especially because this issue of diversity and inclusion has been one that has been high profile in 2020 for months now.
You know, the other thing I'd add to that too is, you know, you think about the Wells Fargo case, you don't have to look around a lot of boardrooms in America to realize that there's a diversity problem in leadership at large companies, right? And part of the way that you avert a problem later is you take action earlier. So, you know, if you've got an army of lobbyists and you've got a lot of weight and influence in the public policy process and you've got a big podium, you know, use that to start building diverse pipelines, whether it's educational or promotion or recruitment. You know, figure out your tool set and go do something about it, because standing there waiting to get punched is a bad strategy. And I think that's a lot of what happened there, right? It was, you know, letting a problem get to a point that it was a crisis, not acting early, and then having the crisis that in hindsight we all could have predicted would have occurred, you know, in the scenario.
And the last thing I'll mention on that is, you know, we are talking about examples, real life examples from companies, but you got to ask yourself as a brand, could this happen to us? Has this happened to us on a much smaller scale that nobody heard about? And so we were spared the big negative, you know, national news headlines. You know, so you've got to put yourself in the shoes of these companies and say, okay, if that were to happen to us, what do we do?
All right, so let's pivot from there. I know that there's a lot of folks listening who probably can relate to that in some form or fashion, so it's good food for thought. I do want to pivot to Nick and Brad, obviously from public affairs perspective. As politics, as we've discussed, you know, are really becoming increasingly polarized and controversial. How do companies promote and create an effective or even a robust public affairs program? I know that's probably not a, you know, 2-minute answer that you can solve. Maybe a phone call could solve for it, but kind of what's the overview there, Nick and Brad?
You know, look, there is still absolutely a place to have business goals that you have to accomplish that accrue to your profitability, that may periodically cause you to do things that are disaligned with your core values or, you know, with the social norms in your boardroom. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? Think about the Georgia film tax credit and the collision between Georgia being the absolute most attractive place in the country to make a movie and the fact that in many parts of the state, we're still quite politically conservative. And, you know, again, that's, I think, in a lot of ways, an internal communication challenge. And part of this is I think businesses realizing that we've moved beyond a world where everything can be carefully scripted and not talked about or talked about quietly and done, and into a world where virtually every decision you make is going to get someone's attention. And so you need to start explaining to your stakeholders that, look, we've got profitability, we've got things that we have opinions about, and we're going to selectively and strategically achieve both things. And that, you know, I think you get a lot of cover when you do decide to speak out on something, that you do it in a real big, meaningful, non-fake way, and you go move the needle, you know, versus sort of chucking out a 2-sentence tweet and saying, hey, okay, we checked the box, we said something. Because, you know, if you look at whether it's voter behavior or consumer behavior, people love to uncover and destroy a fake or a hypocrite. So you don't ever want to be one of those two things. And it means that I think in this issue area, you're careful when you take a position on things. When you do take a position on them, you have a very good explanation for why you're doing it. And you have a strategy to communicate it before you do it, while you're doing it, and after you're doing it. Because the sort of hide in a bunker and hope it works out strategy just isn't really very optimal anymore.
Yeah, this gets back to the idea that your brand needs to have a policy persona unto itself, right? If you're Uber, you're that urban mobility party. You're not Republican. You're not Democrat. There are on many issues, you're going to find that different political constituencies are going to have things that they find attractive or unattractive about issues that are important to your brand. We had a major victory last year for a large client of ours on a tax issue, which resulted from years of stitching together portions of the Tea Party on the Republican side with the Democratic caucus because of how it would play out to communities of color and low-income communities on a major tax issue, right? So you wind up with a coalition of odd bedfellows that would not normally occur if you think about the partisan mudslinging out there, but that really united from having a platform that was policy oriented rather than distinctly political.
All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left, so we're going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions and then final thoughts. Okay, Anne, I'm going to turn this one to you. Social media, you alluded to it earlier. As we know, it's innocuous comments or posts on social media can be misconstrued. They could even come off as tone deaf in times of very high tension, which the United States is experiencing right now to an extent. How exactly should brands approach content on their social and digital channels in the coming days? And how do you recommend brands respond to critical comments on social pages or any online accusations?
Social media. As a local elected official, I love it and I hate it all at the same time.
We could spend a couple of hours just talking social.
I'll be tight here with this one. So let's talk about what's coming up in the next few weeks. And I would say it's not just the next 3 to 4 weeks. Let's monitor to see when we have a decision on the election. So just look at your content calendar, right? Get your social teams to do that. If anything can be remotely interpreted as political, nix it, right? I was a middle school teacher. I can look at these things and poke holes in them and tell you what someone's going to come up with. So make sure you're really looking at that content calendar, especially if you're scheduling things ahead of time. Unless your company has already taken a stand, right? And we've talked about this already. That one universal message right now is vote. And I think it's fine to have your employees go out and take pictures of them, photos in line voting, and maybe your company has a voting hashtag. I know there's one Democracy Days for the Georgia Bankers Association. So, I think it's okay to do those types of things and have fun with that. It's community building and nonpartisan. And then, let's go to the second part of your question. Something is always going to come up, right? Be prepared with a good proactive process, whether it's election season or not. And I know all of you on this call have this. You have social media teams, you have policies in place that are approved by your leadership. I think the biggest thing is to practice scenarios and outline responses. You can't wait 24 hours to respond anymore while everybody's approving that statement. Have some holding statements in place. You're not going to come up with every scenario, but I think you could do a pretty good job. And really, like I said, put it into practice. Have you ever been through a social media crisis simulation? Call Charles and me. We will take you through one. We've done it for clients before. And it's really eye-opening because you have a process on paper, but can you really put that into action? Second piece, and I know you want to keep it tight, your response should always correlate to the severity of the situation. Yes, people are talking about you, but it's not always a crisis. In your head, yeah, it's a crisis. But you've got to look at using a tiered approach. Is this tweet or is this, post on Facebook, is it an individual's issue? Can you take care of it right away? Or could it result in broader online discussions? Also, look at who is tweeting at you. Is this person always somebody who's inflammatory? Don't engage. Or is this somebody who has a huge following and you need to answer their question? And I'd really like to use an example from the weekend that I've been reading about. Purdue Farms, Purdue Chicken, they sell chicken. They're out of Salisbury, Maryland. Well, on Saturday, their social media team awoke to a storm telling them, how dare you have your family member, Senator David Perdue of Georgia, not be able to pronounce Senator Harris's first name and make fun of it. And they were in a storm all weekend saying that David Perdue is not part of the Perdue family. Did they ever come up with that scenario? Probably not, but I'm sure their team has had practice in responding to many different types of issues so they could put it into play. Not what they came up with, but they really had to respond quickly because there was a huge public outcry to boycott them as a brand. So practice and come to a social media crisis simulation with us.
I just want to volunteer, me and Nick, if y'all need somebody to post something really outrageous or be really offended by someone else's post, we've got a significant experience of that. So just put us in whenever you need.
Be part of the team with us. That'd be great. We could do some.
We're better at making problems than fixing them.
Yeah, I already told Brad in an offline discussion, I was like, if you need some help with your reputation, I'd be happy to help you with that. Okay, so we're going to do one more question before final remarks. Going to turn this one to Brad and Charles. This is a couple of questions from different people kind of piled into one. Many brands, like the folks attending today, have probably carefully planned their activities, we hope, right, Ann, up until the election. But if the election is close and it's disputed, we are going to enter some uncharted territory. So, Brad, is it too late to establish a strategy for election day policies? And then to Charles, how exactly do brands plan their communications internally and externally for this kind of uncertainty in their business, especially post-election?
So, just layup question. No, it's never too late to start thinking about what's going to hit you around the corner. It seems likely we're all going to be hit with stuff, and that that some of the post-election activity may run into business operations in a way that makes it business relevant. Obviously, extended uncertainty about a presidential outcome or an extra 30 days where we don't know who's going to control the United States Senate, or some of the other scenarios that could easily happen, are going to have share price impacts, supply chain impacts, customer behavior impacts, employee impacts. And, I think it's good basic business prudency to start, this is going to happen. So you should think about what you're going to do when it does.
To just add on what Brad said, I think one of the big things that brands can do right now is have a cross-functional issues management team where it's legal, operations, and communications at the table. They can each report in on the different pieces of feedback that they're getting from their side of the business, and you can come together and figure out, okay, is there something we need to react to? Is there something we need to respond to? And then quickly and nimbly, pivot based on that information. But I think one of the biggest benefits for all companies, whether it's racial, social injustice, or even COVID, is just having a cross-functional issues management team ready to react to things at a moment's notice.
And to underscore what Charles said on that, he mentioned legal first. I suspect he did that for a reason. Exercising your First Amendment rights on an issue is not something that's extensively regulated. Everything that touches an election is highly regulated. It involves, criminal and civil liabilities that are significant. And I'll give you a couple of the ways that the reasons why you need to talk to your in-house lawyer and potentially engage an outside elections lawyer. One, you might think that it's okay to just ask people to vote. But if the way your program is structured results in more Republicans being asked to vote than Democrats or vice versa, you've then made a political expenditure and you have to disclose it. And if you don't, you can get fined and prosecuted. And if you then go a step further and start to actually advocate for the defeat or election of a candidate in a way other than just making a passive political contribution, that's highly regulated. And the world of political contributions is even more highly regulated. I can give you names of a half dozen former executives I know who got to wear a bracelet on their ankle for a couple of years because they put money into this politician or that politician's campaign without playing by the rules. So just would none of us are in the legal business, so this isn't self-serving, but have a lawyer, talk to them. Don't do anything in elections without doing that.
All right, so we've talked about a ton of material. I think that everyone here and maybe hopefully for you all watching could agree we could probably talk about this ad nauseum. And hopefully you have learned some new information that you can take back to your teams. But just want to ask this panel to zero in on one key takeaway. What to do, what not to do. If someone here only takes away one thing from Real Talk today, what do you think it should be? Give me about your answer in about 30 seconds. Brad, going to start with you, then Anne, Nick, and then wrap with Charles.
I just say don't be a fake. You know, if you're gonna engage in something, do it for real, do it meaningfully, and have a core value that you deeply believe in that ties back to it.
Anne, it's all you.
Prepare and practice, but I'm a politician, so I'm going to get a second one in. Make sure that your comms team is aligned and working with your public affairs team, because a lot of times we're kept in silos. And so public affairs is working with legal and we're working with a comms team. And I think it's really good if we break down those silos, like Charles said, and communicate on issues more often.
Nick?
Create and define a political stance or a political wrapping for your brand that is bipartisan and that has bipartisan appeal, going back to that party of urban mobility versus party of the Republicans or the Democrats. And I'll very much echo Anne's point that all points of your business need to be aligned on your external messaging. Legal, public affairs, so both your government relations and your marketing have to all be joined at the hip so that you're saying things very consistently. There's a lot of unforced errors out there from companies communicating very differently and getting themselves in a lot of trouble with policymakers because of that.
Finally, I'll just say, prioritize your employees as your top audience. That goes for pre-election day, on election day, and then after election day. You are not going to go wrong by regularly polling and asking your employees what's important to them as it relates to fill in the blank topic, and then basing your actions upon what you're hearing from your employees. Everything else I think will take care of itself, but prioritize your employees first.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks to you, Nick, Brad, and Anne, and thanks for everyone who tuned in today from your home, from your office, or me like in my mother's house for attending our Real Talk webinar. Now, if you didn't get your question answered, or maybe you think of some more questions that you'd like this group to address, please email us at realtalk@jacksonspalding.com. We'll be sure to respond to you. You can also sign up to receive JS's daily Rethink 2020 brief. We send those out to some of our clients and friends based on your region and news. And then we share regular blog content and updates through our email newsletter, Think Brief. Some of you were invited through that, so you can sign up for the Think Brief on our website. Plus, we'll share a recap and the recorded video of this entire conversation later this week. And we also welcome your feedback into that survey. It gets us to our new topics and conversation talk points. I mean, the whole point of Real Talk is we want to make it what you want to talk about. So on behalf of this entire team at Jackson Spalding and our friends at Impact Public Affairs, thank you for making the time to join us. We want you to stay well, and we really hope to see you at our next Real Talk event. Have a great afternoon, everyone.